Hello and welcome back to another episode of Notion Bonsai, and in this bonsai video I'm going to be showing you how to create your very own tanuki bonsai. We're going to start with a much larger tree, create the tanuki, style it, and then later we're going to move on to a much smaller shohin sized bonsai. And I'm just going to give you guys a few ideas and approaches to creating one of these compositions that you can apply to your very own creations. And stick around to the end of this video where we open a really exciting package. Alright, so before we begin, you may be a complete beginner to bonsai and you may be thinking, what is a tanuki and what does it mean in bonsai? In bonsai, the term tanuki, sometimes referred to as a phoenix graft, is a unique bonsai technique that brings dead wood and a young living tree together to create the illusion of an old tree that you would see in nature. The name tanuki comes from Japanese folklore, and the tanuki is sort of a mischievous, shape-shifting raccoon dog that likes to deceive people. So in the same way, when we create a tree with a piece of dead wood and you put a young tree together with it, we are sort of deceiving the viewer in making them think that this is how that tree naturally grew, because there are some bonsai where they do have a deadwood feature and a live vein runs around that. And there are trees that are completely natural in bonsai that look like this. A tanuki is somewhat of a creative shortcut, but I think it's really nice to be able to use a really beautiful piece of deadwood that you find in the wild and put it to some use as a bonsai design. Personally, I think a tanuki can look quite beautiful and it really gives you a beautiful result in a much shorter time frame. When it comes to creating a tanuki bonsai, selecting the deadwood is probably one of the most important parts, because visually it's going to be one of the most striking elements of the design. So if you have a piece of wood and it really has no interest to it and it's very rounded and there's no detail on the wood, this could make your tanuki look kind of boring. Personally, I think the more contorted and twisted and interesting the wood, the better. These two pieces of wood that I have here are actually Irish bogwood, and they probably date back to around 3,000 to 7,000 years ago. This wood has been preserved in the Irish boglands because of the acidity of the soil. It's just so acidic that bacteria and fungus can't really form and break the wood down, so it's been preserved. And as a result, it gives this wood such a beautiful texture to it. You can see the knots in the wood, the grain of the wood, and just the age of it, which you really can't replicate with carving tools. This is something only nature can make. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about deadwood. I really love deadwood pieces like this. Of course, if you can't get any bogwood in your area for whatever reason, there are other options available like driftwood that you would find at a beach. And for whatever reason, if you're not beside a beach or you can't go to a beach, you can either buy some deadwood online. There's plenty of sellers that sell pieces like this. Or if you had been doing bonsai for some time and you had one of your trees unfortunately die on you, you can put its old trunk to good use by simply wrapping a piece of live material around that and creating a tanuki that way. Now, I've had these pieces of deadwood in my garden for the past 2 years and I really didn't know what to do with them, but today I finally decided I'm going to make a tanuki. This one could be nice in the future for a bigger tree, but I really love the texture and movement on this one, and I'm thinking this one could be planted at this angle or even up like this. I like this angle. So this would be the base of the planting and then the tree would emanate from here. But there is an important step I would like to consider. Last year I treated this piece of wood and the other piece with some lime sulfur just to whiten the wood before I create a tanuki onto it. But as you can see on this wood now already, it's beginning to grow some algae on the surface. Because this wood is no longer in the bog, or if you have driftwood, it's no longer in the sea with all the salt. It's essentially no longer being preserved. So it's up to us now to keep the wood in good shape. Looking close, you can see there is quite a lot of algae buildup on this piece of deadwood. Ordinarily, if this was just attached to a tree, I would go ahead with the lime sulfur, but because I have the flexibility of treating this wood first, and I don't have to worry about any products running down into the soil of a tree, I'm first going to treat this with some algae remover just to make this really clean before we go in with the lime sulfur. So I'm just pouring out some algae remover. If you wanted, you could also use some white vinegar. I find this does the trick really well too. With old pieces of deadwood like this, there can be so many delicate parts, so if you wish to and your deadwood is strong, you could use a nylon brush. But just personally, I like to use a toothbrush with really fine bristles. You can see here how fine the bristles are on this one. So as you can see here, this is quite a delicate piece of the deadwood. We can scrub this with the fine bristles, no problem, and it doesn't damage the deadwood. And I've also found that using a brush with much thinner bristles can get in between a lot of the cracks easier. So we can actually end up cleaning this a lot more thoroughly. So as you can see, most of the algae has now been removed from this piece of deadwood, and now it is time to apply the lime sulfur. And I just want to say, as a really important note, before you apply the lime sulfur, you want to make sure that all the product that you used previously to remove any algae is completely washed away. Really give the wood a good thorough washing, because you don't want any chemical interactions between whatever you used on the wood and then with the lime sulfur, because it can be toxic. Now before we begin using lime sulfur, safety is extremely important. You want to wear something with long sleeves or a piece of old clothing. That way any sparks from the lime sulfur doesn't get onto your skin or damage your clothes. I'm just using a lab coat. Wear gloves and eye protection. That way no lime sulfur gets into your eyes, and especially if you're doing a large piece of deadwood, you really want to do this in a well ventilated area. I'm doing it outdoors. In order to whiten and preserve the deadwood effectively, you really want to make sure that you're using some high quality lime sulfur, because if you're using low grade lime sulfur or even watered down lime sulfur, you may have to treat the wood a few times before you get the desired result. And you know your lime sulfur is high quality as it will have this deep rich orange reddish color to it. The lime sulfur that I'm using in this video today is my own product that I sell on my store and ship throughout the UK. This is a 250ml bottle, but I also have 100ml available if you're working on a smaller piece of deadwood or if you have less trees. And then by request, some of you guys were asking for an even smaller bottle because you have smaller trees and much less trees than I have. So the newest product in this line is the 50ml bottle. All of these are available on my store, notionbonsai.com, if you're interested. If you're working on a table and you don't want to get any lime sulfur on your table, I recommend putting down some newspaper or even some black plastic bags like I have here. It's a good idea just to mist the deadwood with some water. You don't need much, just a light layer on top, and this makes it so much easier to spread. To do this, I recommend using an old cheap paintbrush because the lime sulfur can damage the bristles of a nice new brush that is quite expensive. I'm just dipping it into the lime sulfur, taking away any excess, and then we can begin painting it on the deadwood. And as you can see, with that water layer underneath, it spreads so easily and covers all the wood really effectively. And also by putting that base layer of water down first means you actually save money on your lime sulfur. Therefore you can do a lot more projects with it. And as you can see, because this lime sulfur is so high quality, you can see only after 2 minutes it's already beginning to whiten this area as it oxidizes in the air. So now this wood is all thoroughly covered, and as you can see, I haven't even used all of the lime sulfur that I first put into this beaker. So you really don't need much when doing projects. Now I'm just going to let this sit out, oxidize in the sun. Usually you want to wait about 24 hours just to ensure that everything has completely oxidized on the wood before moving on to the next step. So while the big piece of deadwood is drying, I'd like to turn my attention to this little smaller piece of deadwood that I collected. This is also a piece of Irish bogwood. This piece has already been treated with lime sulfur and has been dried for the last week now. And I really like this piece of wood because it has this really nice, interesting movement and line to it. Of course, if you didn't want to use such a simple piece of deadwood like this, you could turn your attention to a more interesting one like this. This was previously a bonsai that had died. This is the root mass that I kept at the bottom. So perhaps if you wanted to, you could even invert it, have this as the top, take your tanuki up this way. It's really up to you. But for today, I really want to stick to this simple design and see what I can make from it. And now before we begin, the tools and supplies that we'll be using throughout this video today are cable ties, gene pliers, twig cutters, branch cutters, bonsai tweezers, and some aluminium bonsai wire. If you're just getting started in bonsai and you don't have any of these specialized bonsai scissors, you can get by with just an ordinary pair of garden secateurs or even some small garden scissors. Just use whatever you have around at your disposal to get a particular job done. You just want to make sure that whatever scissors that you are using are clean and sharp. Clean so we don't introduce any bacterial or fungal infections onto our trees as we cut them. And sharp because a sharp pair of scissors will give you a much cleaner cut. And in horticulture, a clean cut will heal so much faster and more efficiently than a blunt cut on a branch that was squashed by a dull blade. Now here I have two Itoigawa juniper cuttings. I got these on my last visit to Heron's Bonsai Nursery, and I did get them relatively cheap. I think these were £5 each, which works out to about $6.50 each. For this tanuki, I am only going to use one of these. I think I will use this one because this one has a lower branch down here that I can use. Here I'm just going to cut off any dead branches or weak growth. As you can see, this branch is quite healthy. This one up here isn't looking too good, so I'm just going to cut that right off. Here there is a dead branch. Just cleaning up the tree before we can work with it. I want to take this little tree out of the pot and just examine the condition of the roots. Alright, so this tree has got quite a lot of roots, way more than I had expected. They're almost just about reaching the edge of the pot. So as you can see here at the base, I've just wrapped it around this piece of the deadwood. Before I continue up the tree, if I start bending the top part, this part can actually get dislodged. So before I move on, I'm just going to cable tie this in place. If you do not have cable ties, you can also just use a little piece of aluminium bonsai wire. And really don't be afraid to make it nice and tight. Now moving further up on the trunk, as you can see, this deadwood sort of has a groove in this area here. And I think this branch can fit really nicely into it if I just position it down like that, trying not to crush any of the foliage as I position the tree. If I come down this way and I fasten the tree, I think that would look really natural as it thickens over time. So I'm just going to take another cable tie, and just where this lays along the deadwood here, I think it looks really natural. I don't want to spiral it around the trunk too much, although this can give you more interest, and if the piece of deadwood you're using lends itself to a spiral the whole way around, by all means do this, but just in this instance, I think it would look nice if it just followed the line of the deadwood. I don't want to force this tree into a design that the deadwood doesn't lend itself to. I would much rather work with what I have here. That way you'll get a more natural look rather than something you just tried to force. So as you can see now, this would be the position. And for the top here, I'm not going to cable tie or wire or position any of the branches just yet. I don't think these branches are really old enough or strong enough to begin doing things to. But of course, as the top part of this tree gets longer and thickens, I can always come in and add another cable tie to secure it up here. That way it can fuse and adhere to the deadwood. And then later, when all this fills out, we can begin styling this tree. But I think as an overall design, I don't really want this tree to be any taller than this. So I'm just going to clip these cable ties. And the only thing that I'm going to change for now is the planting angle. If you do disturb the roots like this in autumn, or you even do an autumn repot, I would recommend protecting it from the frost as the winter months come in. Just looking at this, I'm thinking if I'm going to do a repot, which I have just done anyways, I might as well at this time of year plant it into something worthwhile planting it into. This little pot isn't really going to progress the tree or thicken it any further. It's just something simply to keep it in to sell as a cutting. So here is the pond basket. These allow lots of oxygen into the roots. Using a pond basket combined with really aerated free draining bonsai soil, like a mix of pumice, akadama and lava rock, really allows a tree to thrive. And I think by putting the juniper into this, this will help it get really healthy. Now I'm just going to position this in the pond basket in the angle that I have chosen. I really like that. Now I really want to plant this tree nice and deep in the pond basket. I'm not afraid of covering any deadwood because I will remove that next spring once the trees began to fill out the pot. The only thing that I'm worried about right now is keeping the tree stable, because if the tree isn't stable and there is any wind and the tree happens to wobble, any newly growing roots that's emerging in the soil could get damaged from the wobbles. So just to keep this extra secure in the pot and steady, I'm just going to put a heavy rock behind this. If you don't have any big rocks like this, you could also secure your tree in the pot with some bonsai wire or chopsticks running across. But for now, I'm pretty happy with this. So it is now the following day and this piece of deadwood has been allowed to completely dry. All the lime sulfur has oxidized on the surface, and as you can see, as a result, it has been successfully whitened. I really love how it brings out the detail of the grain of the wood and also adds a little bit more edge to it, as if the deadwood had been whitened by the sun over many years. And while I was at this, I also took the time to whiten the other piece of deadwood. This piece right here, I think this looks really cool too. This will be for another project, but I just thought I'd show you guys the results. Now, aside from the deadwood, another really important part of creating a tanuki is of course the material that we use to put against the deadwood. In general, junipers are used more popularly because they lend themselves well to being fused with a piece of deadwood. And on top of that, naturally in the wild, as junipers grow, big branches die off, half the trunk dies off. And in a way, when we create a tanuki with a juniper species, we're almost trying to replicate what junipers do in the wild. And now the species that I'll be using in this video today is this. This is a Chamaecyparis laciniana and it is of the variety Wesselii. I really like this one because it has really dense foliage, and I think over time when it is fused to the deadwood, it will make creating pads on the overall shape a lot easier by having a naturally growing dense foliage like this. And it also has this beautiful bluish tint to the foliage that I personally really like. It is somewhat of an unconventional species to use for a tanuki, again the most popular being junipers, but I think this, because it is so flexible too, will really lend itself to the overall design. When choosing material, you really want a piece of material that is nice and flexible. Pines can also be used to create a tanuki, but with these I would recommend starting off with a much younger, thinner piece of material that can easily fit into the grooves of the deadwood. With junipers, it's pretty easy to get them to fuse to the wood in quite a short period of time, but with a pine's natural growth habit, once they have got pretty thick and you try and fuse it, pines do tend to take just a little bit longer than junipers. So if you start with a thinner piece of material, get it into the grooves, when that thickens, it will really adhere itself and bind to the wood. If you plan on trying it with a deciduous species like a maple, this is a little bit unconventional, but it can give you such beautiful results if it is done thoroughly. Japanese maples like trident maples or just the normal Acer parmatum have this nice smooth bark, and when it is fused to a piece of deadwood like this, it can blend in pretty seamlessly. But then again, on the other hand, if you wanted to create something with a little bit more contrast and a bit of craggly bark, you could use deciduous species like a corkbark elm or even an Arakawa maple. The only thing that I would say when doing it with a deciduous species is just be very careful, because their bark is a little bit softer than something like an evergreen. So if I was cable tying it to a piece of deadwood, I would definitely protect it with some raffia. Also, I do want to show off, this is a Shishigashira Japanese maple. I just wanted to show off the beautiful autumn colors that it has. It has this really nice red foliage to it, but then sort of in the background there's this purplish hue, which I think looks really beautiful at this time of year. So just looking at this tree, before we go and merge it with the deadwood, I first want to start by taking away anything that could cause problems as we merge this with the deadwood, which is just simply removing any dead branches. Doesn't take much to do this. Just go in, pluck out all this dying foliage, and I would do this with any tree that you're planning to merge with deadwood, because you want it to look nice and neat in the end, and you don't want this to cause any problems for you in the future. Any of these that don't come off as easily, you can just cut with some bonsai scissors. This one is dead, cut that here. Now that I've got this tree nice and cleaned, I really want to see what's going on down at the base here. I'm not going to do a repot of this tree as it is not the correct time of year to repot. It is mid-autumn for me right now. All I want to do is just remove some of this top layer of loose soil to see what's going on down below the surface. It's okay to disturb a little bit of the roots at the top, so long as your tree has lots of healthy roots down below. You don't want to disturb any of these roots down here until you come to repot in spring. So this seems to be a multi-trunk tree. It's got this one one coming off to the side here that we could use. It's got a trunk here in the middle, and then off of that at the base, we've got 2 branches coming from there. And now on to the fun part. This is the part where you can really use your imagination, experiment with different ideas. Just as a general rule, if possible, try and get the branches of your tree to run with the grain of the wood. This might not always be possible because some pieces of dead wood have so much twisty knots like this one. So I'm just going to take this, push it against the dead wood, see where branches can go. This is the angle that I really like for this piece of dead wood. It sits nicely like this. So I'm just pushing it against the dead wood. Now because these cable ties just aren't long enough to go around the tree and the dead wood, I'm going to interlock 2 together. That's them 2 secured. Now this should be able to go around everything. So I'm going to start with the main branch in the center. That's the one I really want to keep. So I'm going to start with that. So position the dead wood how I like. And it is kind of interesting experimenting with the dead wood and the tree, because usually in bonsai we select a front for the tree, where in this case the dead wood has a front, the tree has a front. How can we get them both to work together? Which front has priority? So is the deadwood's front more important than the trees? Personally, I think this would depend on the material. In my case, definitely the deadwood. That's what I want to show off the most. You can get 100 different trees that look like this one, so it doesn't really have any special features that I want to show off. So I really want to prioritize how the deadwood looks with the tree attached to it. So if this is my front here, I want the tree to begin coming up the back and around maybe. Feeding the cable tie around the trunk, this isn't really anything complex. Just because this is quite a big project doesn't mean it's complicated. And I go really tight with this if you wish to protect the bark. So I'm just tightening this onto here. I'm now all out of cable ties, so as a bonus part of this video, I'm going to be showing you the alternate method of using bonsai wire. This is just some aluminium bonsai wire, and I believe it is 2.5 millimeter. This way is also pretty straightforward. You just take a little length of wire. I'm going to cut this with the wire cutters. So I would like this branch coming up along here against the wood, and then I want it to take a sharp angle and go up this piece of the dead wood. Now if you wish to protect the wood from the wire, you can take the raffia, wet it, you can wrap it around the young tree and the dead wood and try and get it to fuse that way. Even on top of the raffia, you can add the wire to really secure it in place. But just because there's so many elements to this, I don't want to be applying raffia all day. Another thing you can use is this. This is medical tape. This can also be used to protect the tree from wire. It's sticky on one side, really easy to remove, nice and soft. So I'm just going to apply this along the wood. So I'm just going to stick this down just enough to protect it. I'm going to double this up so it's a little bit more protective. Then we can come around with the wire. I'm just laying the wire across where I know it's going to be. And then with the gin pliers, we can begin tightening the wire, and this should hold the tree in position. You don't want to go too much where you damage the dead wood either, just enough to hold it in place. And as you can see, this does the job pretty nicely. When I push on this branch now, it's actually secured right from this point. So I'm going to do the same thing, securing this dead wood the whole way up this part. Now where possible, you want to find grooves to put the tree into. So on the dead wood here, I found a little hole right there, and I think if this tree didn't have foliage, this would fit really nicely into there. So for that reason, I'm simply going to remove just a little bit of the foliage on this part. So as you can see now, just like that, this piece of wood fits really snug into that gap. Because this is a thinner part of the tree, even as you can see up here, this part of the tree has not yet lignified, meaning it hasn't become woody. I know at this point here, it's lignified, and up here it's not. So just be careful where you apply wire. This wire is also too thick for this branch. I could risk damaging it. So I'm just switching down to some 1.5 millimeter wire, and this will work so much better. On the part where this main branch is going to lay across the dead wood here, there's many pieces of foliage in here, which just aren't going to make it whenever we press this against the dead wood, and this will give us much better contact against the wood. No piece of material is 100% perfect. You're not going to use all of it every single time. With these branches, just on how they're positioned and the angle coming from this area of the trunk, it's going to be very challenging to get these to merge in a way that looks natural. Also, if I leave these, the tree's diverting energy to these and this part, where I wanted to put all of its energy into this part and more focus into getting this longer and as a result thicker. Yes, keeping these branches will help thicken the base of the tree, but in this case I don't really want great taper on this part where it goes from really thick into thinner. I would rather the taper happen from only the growth of this branch. That way it looks a little bit more natural. I'm just going to remove these completely. The main one looks pretty natural. Also, this other one coming up here works in the way that it curves around, but this one having this sort of twin trunk thing going on here where I'm trying to make it work, and I think long term this probably wouldn't work because of the big gap in here. Again, not every branch is going to work, so in this case I personally feel like this is a scenario where less is more. I'm going to play the long game, focus on this one branch becoming the main live feature, and we're going to cut this off. If you wish to, you can grow the pieces that you cut off of your tree from cuttings. And you can take a cutting in one of two ways. You can take either a heel cutting or a nodal cutting. A heel cutting is when you take a branch off of a thicker branch like this and tear it at the base here. This is known as a heel. I like to cut off this part. You want the cutting planted half the depth as the cutting is long. So from here, I'm simply going to just cut off all these lower branches. Then you'll have something that looks like this. Simply wet the end of it, dip it into some hormone rooting powder. I like to cover a good amount of it. Then you can take this, stick it into some rooting substrate like compost and perlite, and it should root. The only thing I would say is I would advise using a rooting powder with the active ingredient IBA, also known as indole 3-butyric acid. This product I'm using right here is available on my website. This one is Root Growth Pro, but you can use any rooting hormone that you like. And now nodal cutting is simply when you take a branch, everywhere on this stem where other branches are beginning to emerge is known as nodes. You cut just below one of these, and then again you can take this, put it into some rooting hormone, into soil, and it should root. Now if you wanted to, you could try and get this back into its original pot. It may look a little bit strange. Let's see if I can do this. So this could work just until spring comes around next year. Then we can give this a proper repot, but I really don't like how flimsy this is. This could easily damage the roots and tree. Instead, what I'm going to do is a slip pot. Now slip potting in bonsai and even with houseplants is a pretty controversial topic. In general, it's not good for the tree to do a slip pot when it's time to give the tree a repot. A repot involves removing all the soil or the majority of the soil, unless it's a pine where you need the mycelium. Then you put in fresh soil, get everything reinvigorated so the tree can then thrive. Now a slip pot is simply taking a tree out of a pot that it was just in, upsizing the pot, keeping everything, the root mass together, and plopping that into a larger pot and hoping that somehow helps the tree grow. I'm not one for slip potting, but in this instance, I am going to slip pot it into this slightly larger pot just to get the tree into a good position where it won't wobble, and also to keep the roots warm throughout the winter. And then next year, whenever the following spring comes around, I'm going to go in and give it a proper full repot. Just because of the nature of a tanuki, I feel like this would be a lot better. So this is an angle that I'm pretty happy with in the pot. I think it's going to be easy to get this stable like this. I'm using a mix of pumice, akadama, lava rock, and the majority of it is ericaceous compost. And now to keep this really stable in the pot, because I want this up like this and the weight of this side really wants to pull it down that way, I'm going to take a piece of wire, bringing it around this piece of deadwood, and with this I'm bringing it down onto the pot, and then we can go and tighten this wire. Just taking a chopstick, working out any air gaps that may be in the soil, and this will also help it become more stable. And with that, I'm pretty happy with this. And now it is time to open the really exciting package. I already opened it. It is this. This is a book from Dave over at the channel Blue Sky Bonsai. He spent the last year writing this book, and it is called Bonsai: The Blue Sky Way, a simple guide to bonsai horticulture. Now, I'm not paid to show off this book. Dave just sent me this book out of kindness. I've read it all. I just think it's a really nice guide, not only for beginners to bonsai, but even as you come into the more advanced levels, there are some pretty advanced techniques in here that's really helpful. Now, without giving too much away of what's in this book, he covers everything from like growing bonsai from seed, from cuttings, air layerings, and even talks about something called a perched water table, which he covers in one of his YouTube videos. I think this is a really nice visual representation on how to create taper on a bonsai trunk via trunk chops. But I just want to say, Dave, thank you very much for sending me this book. I really enjoyed it, and if you guys want to check it out for yourselves, I will leave an Amazon link where you can get this book in the description of this video. And on that, I'm going to end off this video right here. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like on this video. It really helps out the channel a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And please let me know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. Perhaps there is something you would have done differently with a tanuki of this style. I'm always open to new and different ideas in bonsai. If you would like to support me in the things that I do on this channel, hit the thanks button down below. Or if you would like to become a channel member, hit the join button. That way you'll get early access to new videos before they go out to everyone else, and you will get access to membership posts. If you'd like to keep up to date with all the things that I do off YouTube, please follow me on Instagram. It is @NotionBonsai, and you can see all the things that I do on there. But on that, thank you so very much for watching.